Welcome everybody and thank you for coming. I'm Keith Lockage. I'm the Director of Advanced Training at the Ayn Rand Institute. And I'm delighted to welcome our friends representing the Heartland Institute. They're here to speak to us about a report that Heartland has just published on climate change. And we're very glad to have them here because the topic of climate change tends to be dominated by the reports of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the international body that's convened by the United Nations. Now, Ayn Rand once described the United Nations as that contemptible citadel of global hypocrisy. And the IPCC certainly does everything it can to live up to that description. Every 5 years or so, it issues a huge report declaring in ever more shrill terms that because we drive cars and use electricity, we're destroying ourselves and the planet. So fortunately, as a corrective to that, and a voice of sanity on this topic, we have the NIPCC, the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change, to present a rather different and more sober view on the topic. So this is what our speakers are here to talk about today. I'm going to introduce Joe, and then he'll introduce our other panelists. So this is Joe Bast. He's the president and CEO of the Heartland Institute, a national nonprofit research center located in Chicago. And it's one of the most best known and highly regarded think tanks in the country. He's the author of, or editor of 21 books on topics ranging from education to healthcare to environmentalism and many other policy topics. His writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Investors Business Daily, Cato Journal, USA Today, and many other of the nation's largest circulation newspapers. He's been recognized many times for his contributions to public policy research and debate. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Joe.
All right, Keith, thanks very much. All right. Well, first I have to explain the shirt. My wife dresses me. She buys pretty well. The clothes she buys, you can tell, because I have about 15 white dress shirts hanging up in my closet, and every morning I take the first one on the right, and when I get home from work I hang it on the left. So it's just white shirts. And Diane said, well, you don't like wearing ties, especially when you talk, so we'll get you a shirt that doesn't require a tie. So I don't know, I'm not a Pittsburgh Steelers fan like Jim is, but maybe that's what this is all about. So I apologize for that, for anybody who's kind of taken aback by this shirt. Secondly, I'd like to thank the Ayn Rand Institute for hosting this event and for being a great friend of the Heartland Institute over the years. The Ayn Rand Institute is a world-class organization. They are doing just terrific work, so congratulations. It's a very talented group of people, and if anybody here is helping to pay the bills for the Ayn Rand Institute, thank you very much for doing that. And increase your contributions to them if you can. And finally, a word about Ayn Rand. Probably like many people in this room, I started reading her in high school, and then I read everything that she wrote in college. She had a profound impact on the way that I view the world, and still does to this day. The Heartland Institute addresses a wide range of issues with a lot of disciplines, but at the root of it all is still this attention to reason and individualism, private property rights, and free enterprise. And it all does go back to Ayn Rand. So it's kind of a special privilege to be able to speak at an organization that's devoted to the ideas of a woman who had such a big impact on me. The Heartland Institute first started to address global warming back in 1993. Heartland actually got started in '84. We cover a wide range of public policy issues, everything from school reform to healthcare to tax reform and environment. But in 1993, we did a book titled Eco-Sanity, A Common Sense Guide to Environmentalism. And one of the chapters of that book was titled the Scare of the Month, I think is something like that. And there were 12 environmental scares, and one for each month. And it was ozone and pesticides and ALAR and population growth and whatever the other ones were, and one of them was global warming. And back in 1993, we identified that as the mother of all environmental scare tactics. The environmentalists, the left actually, not environmentalists, groups on the left, understood that if you can control energy, you can control human beings. And that's what it was all about. This was a search for a scientific justification for a political agenda that was set well back in I would say the 1960s and the 1970s. Of course, it goes back to the 1930s, and it goes back probably to the dawn of human civilization. But the whole idea is control energy. And if, in fact, the combustion of fossil fuels is having a dangerous impact on climate, you have a recipe for controlling all use of fossil fuels. That's 80–90% of all the energy. If you can control that and shut it down, you can shut down the engines of the world. And that is no less than what the environmental movement wants to do and has been trying to do now, going on 30 years on the global warming debate. So in '93, we first started to address the issue. We then did a couple of policy studies on the issue. And being good libertarians and policy wonks, we were doing economic analysis of climate change. What are the cost benefits of reducing emissions? What's the most market-friendly way of doing this? Cap and trade versus carbon taxes. And we kept running into the question, is it worth doing at all? And the more we looked at the science, the more we concluded, well, no, it's not worth doing at all, because a modest amount of warming over the next 100 years would have more benefits than costs. So why are we even trying to come up with a cost-effective way to reduce emissions if the emissions are not a problem at all? Why are we trying to make socialism more efficient, as Fred Smith at the Competitive Enterprise Institute liked to say? So we're doing these studies, and I think they were really good work, mostly involving economists, and we got no attention at all. Mainstream media ignored us. We couldn't seem to get any traction in public opinion. Even the business groups paid no attention to us. And it occurred to us that what was happening is they were being told that the building was on fire, and they were all racing for the exits. And we were telling them that it was more cost-effective to put out the fire this way than that way. Or you should call this guy instead of this guy to help put out the fire. Or this is, first we should study why this fire got started before we try to put it out. And people are saying, are you nuts? We're trying to get out of this building. We're just trying to save our lives. People were panicked. They were motivated by fear. Fear is just the opposite of reason, and it just puts our whole brain into momentary suspension, and we become gullible. When we're afraid of something, we make poor choices, and we fall for whatever kind of propaganda somebody wants to feed us. The left knew exactly what they were doing. So all of the rhetoric about global warming isn't about how well we understand the science of climate or the natural processes or the link between carbon dioxide and climate change. You see very little of that in the mainstream media, from environmental groups, even from the science community. It's all about powerful, overwhelming, scary images of climate, seemingly natural phenomenon, hurricanes and droughts and melting ice and polar bears swimming seemingly at risk of losing their lives. So we concluded that we have to go after the science. Now, a typical think tank, when they make that sort of decision, they say, well, let's write some op-ed pieces, or let's write a book, or support a guy who's writing a book, and then put him on the road so that he can sell some of his books, maybe even do a little bit of lobbying. We looked at this issue and said, that's not going to cut it. And already by then, this is now about 10 years ago, I'm not going to waste my time writing op-ed pieces and letters to the editor trying to change the world, because as much as I love people who write letters to the editor, and I hope you all continue to do that, you're not changing the world by writing a letter to the editor or getting an op-ed piece printed. So what we needed to do, as I looked at it, is produce a comprehensive research and marketing campaign on this issue. And it's got to start at the top with the scientists, and it's got to work its way all the way down to elementary school classrooms. And we got to come up with products and programs that hit all these different audiences and that are actually effective, and ideally so that we can test their effectiveness. So we're not just throwing away money on feel-good efforts to speak out against a bad policy, but we're actually changing that policy. So at the top of this tier of audiences are the scientists. And the scientists have been buffaloed into believing that this thing is real, that it's a real crisis. And if they want to get published, they have to nod in the direction of this thing. If they want to get a research grant, they got to nod in this direction. If you want tenure, you'd better at least voice agreement with the prevailing thought on this thing. Scientists are no different from any of the rest of us. You end up believing in somebody on the issues that you're not an expert on. And so most scientists are not an expert on climatology. Biologists aren't experts on physics. Physicists aren't experts on geology. Geologists aren't experts on, fill in the blank. There's over 100 specialties that are involved in climate science. And so scientists end up believing what other scientists tell them is true in areas outside their area of specialization. And the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, represents itself as being the consensus of science on climate, and they go to the scientific world and say, trust us, we've scrubbed this out. We represent the consensus. So even though your own research doesn't seem to support a human impact on climate, trust us, other people's do. And then they just kind of go around. I was talking with somebody about Julian Simon. Richard brought up Julian Simon. In his last book, his posthumously published book, Hoodwinking America, Hoodwinking the World? The Nation? Okay. He has this great little anecdote where there's a bunch of scientists sitting around a conference table, and they're talking about environmental problems. And there's an expert on, now I'm going to make it up a little bit, but this is close to how it goes. There's an expert on extinct species, and he says, I can tell you there is no extinction crisis going on. We're not losing species at an alarming rate. There's no science that supports the idea that somehow human impact is causing mass extinctions. However, I do worry about nuclear power. I think we ought to probably do something about nuclear power. Now, this is a guy who knows nothing about nuclear power. The guy sitting across from him is a specialist on nuclear power, and this guy says, well, I can tell you nuclear power is perfectly safe. Okay, I'm an expert on this. I've looked into it. Nuclear power is safe. But I kind of worry about carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel plants. I think we ought to worry about that. Everybody had a specialty. Everybody was projecting their fear and uncertainty into areas that they didn't understand. Okay, and they just kind of worked their way around the table, and they all end up agreeing that there's a crisis on something, but it's not something that they understand or that they know about. And I think that happens over and over again. In the scientific community, the IPCC took advantage of the fact that scientists aren't generalists, don't know all the facts, put their faith in a government agency when they should not have done that, and then end up devoting the rest of their career to finding evidence to support a hypothesis that at the end of the day can't be supported. So we decided to put together a big book that would compete with the IPCC. IPCC puts out huge reports. Just last week they put out their 5th report. Jim Lakely, standing over there, is holding up their 2007 report. This was the 4th assessment report. This is volume 1, the Working Group 1 report on the physical sciences. It's about 1,000 pages long, weighs a ton, beautiful color production throughout. In 2009, we produced a critique of that report titled Climate Change Reconsidered, 800 pages, about 30, 40 authors, and thousands of peer-reviewed articles are reviewed in that thing. It was the first time skeptics got together and did a comprehensive, authoritative critique of the reports of the IPCC. In 2011, we published another book titled Climate Change Reconsidered, the 2011 interim report. That's only summarizing new science that was released since 2008. And so another 400 pages worth of up-to-date science. In 2013, earlier this year, the Chinese Academy of Sciences translated the first 2 volumes of Climate Change Reconsidered and published a condensed version of it. And that's the publication right there. This is really cool because, first of all, the Chinese Academy of Sciences is the 12th highest ranked academic institution in the world, according to Nature, the science journal. It's got over 40,000 scientists who are part of it. It's the world's largest academy of science. They devoted about a year and 20 guys doing the research and the editing in order to produce that book. They then held a conference in Beijing and flew our guys down there. These 2 gentlemen were there to participate, to present their findings to the Chinese scientific community. And finally, this is so toxic to the other side that Greenpeace denies that that book was ever published. So we.
I'd like to just give a round of applause.
Well, thanks. Yeah, thank you very much. And I think it is an amazing thing. And we're hoping it's just the first Academy of Sciences. We need the Russian Academy of Sciences and the Polish Academy of Science and the Australian Academy of Science to follow suit on this. And I think over time they will. So it's a really important breakthrough. So 3 weeks ago now, I suppose, we've been on the road for most of the last 3 weeks, we released our third report in the Climate Change Reconsidered series, and it's that book that he's holding over his head, Climate Change Reconsidered II, Physical Science. It's over 1,000 pages long. It's written by 47 scientists, written and reviewed by 47 scientists from 15 countries. It's got over 4,000 references to peer-reviewed literature. It's been peer-reviewed by the authors themselves, and we've got a growing list of prominent scientists who have endorsed this book. This book now is every bit as good as what the IPCC's reports are. This covers the same science and more than what the IPCC does. It tracks the organization of the IPCC's reports, and it comes to just the opposite conclusion that the IPCC does, specifically that the human impact is very small, that future warming is probably very modest, hard to tell from background variations, and there really is no case for governments attempting to reduce energy consumption and emissions. So I happen to have with me today two of the lead authors of Climate Change Reconsidered II. Robert Carter, it's this gentleman right here. Dr. Carter has his PhD from Cambridge University, and hence his funny accent. But we've been trying now for several weeks to break him of that and get him to speak more like a Wisconsin guy. Dr. Carter is now in Australia. He was born in New Zealand. He is now an Australian. For many years, he taught at James Cook University, where he was professor and head of the School of Earth Sciences from 1981 to 1999. He has a long list of scholarly publications. He is by training a marine geologist. And sitting next to him is Fred Singer, Dr. Fred Singer. Fred is one of the world's most distinguished atmospheric physicists. Fred is an absolute institution. He, for many years, was a professor of environmental sciences at the University of Virginia. Prior to that, he held a number of positions with the government, including chief scientist for the U.S. Department of Transportation. He was the original head of the, looking for the name of it here, the satellite.
Weather satellite.
Weather Satellite Department. Service. Yeah, I don't see it here. The original founder of that. Fred is one of the original rocket scientists in the world. He was part of that group of scientists who are developing, designing, and making the case for public support for rockets and exploration of outer space. His list of scholarly publications runs into the hundreds of articles. An amazing thing, at the age of 89, Fred is still appearing in the peer-reviewed literature. You've been in at least twice, right, so far this year in Energy and Environment. And we got a long list over the last 10 years of articles. I mention that because all of the environmental groups say, oh, Fred Singer is yesterday's news. He doesn't publish anymore in the peer-reviewed literature. He's got a list of publications since 1993 that would get him tenure in most universities. So an amazing guy, and I've just had tremendous privilege of working with Fred over all of these years. Each of these guys is going to talk for about 15 minutes about some of the science and about NIPCC versus the IPCC. So without further ado, Robert Carter.
Thank you, Joe. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure and privilege to be here today as part of the Heartland team, and a special thanks to the Ayn Rand Institute. It is, of course, an almost overwhelming business visiting this institute we've heard about in Australia. It's viewed with awe from 12,000 kilometres distance, and it's viewed with even more awe now I have my picture of the desk in the corner. Okay, what's missing from the public debate is this word. Now, you're used to this discussion about global warming being conducted in terms of a meteorological temperature curve. You've all seen it, and it looks, for the last 150 years, something like this. Now, 150 years of thermometer measurements averaged around the world. It's not me, it's meteorologists like Fred that define weather as different from climate in the following way. Climate is 30 years of average weather at a particular point. Okay, so 30 years, one climate data point. You're already doing the maths in your head. If the temperature record's 150 years long, divided by 30, that is 5 climate data points. Frankly, to me, it is utterly astonishing that on the basis of 5 data points, the world has been talked into revolutionising its energy economy in the last 20 years. It is unbelievable. The curve that's being used to do that is not a climate curve. It's only got 5 climate data points. It's a weather curve. It's all very important in terms of understanding weather processes and climate processes, but it's not as such a climate curve. It's being used out of context. So what I want to do now is show you 3 or 4 slides. They're the same slides that I've shown and other instructors around the world have shown to first-year students in universities studying earth science or geoscience. The science that's in them is at least 20 or 30 years old. It doesn't need to be modern rocket science because it relates to fundamental things that we know about the Earth's climate system. And it's no good asking a meteorologist or a climatologist to tell you these facts because they don't study them. Not part of their ambit. Their ambit is the last 150 years. Here's the first such diagram. Straight away, you see 0 through to 6 million years ago. And you may think, gee, that's deep time. That's just the last little bit of geological history. But there it is. The red curve is the temperature of the surface water in the mid-Pacific Ocean. And it's determined by taking a core sample out of the mud on the seabed. And the mud on the seabed, just like the layers in the ice cores in Antarctica and Greenland, have layers. And as you go down, you're getting to older and older layers. So if you sample down the core, and you can reconstruct the ancient temperature of the water, the chemistry of the water, and so on. It's a climate record, a real climate record. Here it is. Okay, so what we see straight away is that 0 million years, we're here now. And if I thicken up that dotted line, that's today's temperature extrapolated back across the graph. Now, one of the objects of veneration amongst the media is that the late 20th century was somehow unusually warm. This statement constantly comes up, it's the warmest ever. What do they mean by ever? Last 150 years. Okay, so this curve on its own, and I stress again, this is shown to thousands of first-year science students around the world every year, destroys these 3 myths. The first myth is that today's temperature is somehow unusually warm. Well, let's look at that. Here's today's temperature, extrapolated back. Here's the temperature 6 to 3 million years ago. And on this scale, which is about 10 degrees temperature difference in intermediate latitudes equivalent, on this scale, that's 2 to 3 degrees warmer than today. 2 to 3 degrees. Did the planet come to a stop? Was there a biodiversity crisis? Sorry, that's my next point. No, there wasn't. So the idea that today's temperature is unusually warm is just wrong. It's so wrong that it's unbelievable it can be perpetrated day in, day out in the press. Secondly, there's a myth that before the Industrial Revolution, the climate was stable. And then along came man and started up all these horrible factories, and this gentleman in the middle bought a second SUV, and goodness gracious me, the temperature went to hell in a handbasket. Again, total nonsense. Here it is, temperature doing what it always does as representative climate. Climate is always changing. Change is what climate does. The phrase climate change is a tautology. It says the same thing twice. You don't need change, just climate. We all know climate changes. So that's the second myth. The third myth, held by distinguished professors of biology around the world who apparently are totally innocent of knowledge of anything to do with the ancient world and its organisms, is there'll be a biodiversity crisis if the temperature goes up 2 degrees. Well, tell that to all the animals and plants that were living here when it was 2 to 3 degrees warmer, the descendants of which form 99% of all the plants and animals around us today. It's a nonsense. In fact, most of the plants and animals on the planet are pre-adapted genetically to living in warmer temperatures than today because they lived here. So those are the three myths you explode with one simple graph. It's not an opinion, it's a fact. And notice this isn't global temperature, I must point that out, because we have no way of measuring or determining accurately global temperature 6 million years ago. But this is not a cherry-picked graph. It happens to be a graph from the Pacific Ocean. I could show you another similar one from the Atlantic or the Indian Ocean, or for the last bit of the curve, I could go to the ice cores, and they all show this similar climatic pattern. So although this isn't global, it reflects a global pattern. Well, 6 million divided by 30, do you agree this might be a climate record? A real climate record? You can't possibly have a policy on climate change in ignorance of this contextual information. Yet you do have. You've got a government that's actually trying to close down all the power plants in the country based on a belief that a 150-year temperature record of meteorology is adequate for policy setting. If we just take now the last 10,000 years, or 11,000 years, this in blue is temperature as determined from an ice core in Greenland. And we note straight away that, again, climate's always changing. But we also note two things. Firstly, that in the last 11,000 years, the warmest peak is here. And hello, Harry, that's got a name. Well, it used to have. If you look at any textbook older than about 15 years, this is termed the Holocene climatic optimum. Why would that be? Well, because animals and plants actually quite like warm weather. It's actually cold weather. It's glaciations that destroys biodiversity. Warm weather is good. But this word has now become politically incorrect. So it's been removed from all the contemporary discussions on ancient climate that the IPCC is involved with. And if we accept that that's about 8,000 years ago, there was a Holocene climatic optimum, we can see then that there's a gradual cooling trend since then. This is the ups and downs on top of it. But here's this cooling trend over the last 10,000 years. So now a newspaper reporter says to me, Bob, is it warming or cooling at the moment? And I said, well, it's cooling, of course. There it is. The question, is global warming happening, is meaningless. The public opinion polls on this are meaningless. It depends entirely on the length of climate string that you choose to look at, whether the temperature at the moment is perceived as increasing or decreasing. And the long-term trend is it's decreasing. The other interesting thing you see from this is that, yes, there's variability, but that variability is rhythmic, if not cyclic. And the green bars correspond to periods of time. This is the late 20th century warming. There was a little warming in the late 20th century. This is the medieval warm period. This is the Roman warm period. This is the Minoan warm period, and we can go on back, highlighting these. The periodicity between these warm periods is about 1,000 to 1,500 years. And Fred Singer is author of a very well-read book. Title again? Unstoppable Global Warming Every 1,500 Years. This is, if you like, the heartbeat, a longer-term heartbeat of climate change. It's completely ignored by the IPCC. Between the warm periods, we have this period in here during the Middle Ages in Europe and North America called the Little Ice Age. And you see that the warming out of the Little Ice Age that occurred in the late 19th and 20th centuries here is similar to hundreds, just 10 or so here, but if we go further back, to hundreds of previous warmings. Absolutely nothing whatsoever unusual about either the rate or the magnitude of this warming phase in the late 20th century. Last point before we leave this graph, which is fascinating, which is, here we go, so it's cooling for the last 10,000 years. What's this stuff down here? What's that red curve? Oh, that's atmospheric carbon dioxide, as measured from an Antarctic ice core. And at the very time this is cooling for 10,000 years, that can't be right, can it? More carbon dioxide, dangerous global warming. Well, is that so? So why have you never seen either the previous graph or this one? Why have you never read in the Los Angeles Times or the New York Times a discussion of the context of the late 20th century warming and of the fact that although carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, there's virtually no evidence from the fossil record that when it increases, you get dangerous warming. Quite the contrary here, we're getting cooling. That's context for temperature. I now want to give you a contextual graph for carbon dioxide. And now, I'm a geologist, you can see my shoulders relax. 500 million years. We're really getting into good stuff now. This is deep time. Why do we pick 500 million years? That's because these intervals along here, which have names coded with their capital letters, this one stands for Cambrian. This is the period of time over which we have had multicellular metazoan life on the planet. And in the ocean, that means little organisms with shells, little crabby-like things, wormy-like things, molluscan-like things. And here's what they look like. This is an extinct group of sponges, but all the other organisms here, these are brachiopods, this is a little early snail, all of these have modern descendants. And the basic physiology of these ancient fossils 500 million years ago is similar to their descendants today. Of course, the shells look a bit different because evolution's occurred since. No evidence whatsoever that these are any different physiologically from modern organisms living on a shallow seafloor. Well, why are you pointing that out? What's the point of that? Well, the point of that is this curve is of carbon dioxide through time. Cutting through the clutter, it's a decreasing curve, and prior to the Industrial Revolution, this is in parts per million, this scale. Prior to the Industrial Revolution here, carbon dioxide was 280 parts per million. Now, thanks not a little to this gentleman's second SUV, that is now 390 parts per million, or about a 35% increase. That's a significant increase, but it's a very small number in the first place, and a 30% increase of a small number is still a very small number. So we're up to a little bit more, but taking the pre-industrial level of 280 parts per million as one, that's where we are today, this scale plots the number of times the carbon dioxide level was. 5, 10, I don't believe it, 15 times today's level was the carbon dioxide measurements, these two lines here, in the Cambrian period. 15 times. But Greenpeace says if we double carbon dioxide, the planet's going to come to a halt. What a load of nonsense. How does, I mean, this is just kindergarten science. And not only can they not get it right, but they can brainwash the public with exactly the opposite. So carbon dioxide is difficult to reconstruct in ancient environments, which is why there are many different methods of doing it. This graph plots them all. You can see the big error ranges on individual points. So we don't know in precise detail, but we do know there's this declining trend through time, and that during the Cambrian, the carbon dioxide was 15 times. How's that possible? Where did that carbon dioxide come from? Where does nascent carbon dioxide come from? Happens in North America occasionally. Yeah, from volcanoes. Okay. So if this is 500 million years, that's the part of Earth history that has multicellular organisms. Then we go around the room here, and the origin of the Earth's about halfway across the back wall, 4,500 million years ago. And for all that period of time, until the arrival of these multicellular animals, volcanoes were pumping out carbon dioxide and it was accumulating in the atmosphere. That's where these high levels come from. Now, I think it's fair to say that only an Australian could fit a straight line through a bunch of... I mean, let's get real here. So, would you agree that's a better fit? Yes, it is a better fit, isn't it? Okay, so the Australians can redeem themselves after all. So the question is now, what caused this drawdown? There's obviously a dramatic drawdown of carbon dioxide between 400 million and 350 million years ago. What event happened on the planet at that time that uses carbon dioxide, and what for? You all know it, you've all done it at school. Yeah, well, I heard it. Where did it come from? Fred, was that you? It's the evolution, of course, of photosynthetic plants. And those plants grow and they turn into great forests and they suck the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, they die, they accumulate in coal swamps, aerobic coal swamps, and get buried and turn into coal. And lo and behold, we come along and dig that coal up, we put it in power stations, we create the Industrial Revolution, this wonderful modern civilization around us, and what do we do with the carbon dioxide? Well, we put it back into the atmosphere, don't we? Where it came from in the first place. I must be missing something. What's the problem? Okay, jumping this, I've just had the word from the back, I've got to get on. So, things you need to know about NIPCC. The first thing is that that's amongst the fundamental science that NIPCC follows. And a lot of it's not to do with carbon dioxide, it's to do with the broader evidence for climate change through history. NIPCC advisory scientists are fully independent, they're beholden to nobody. Many of them are retired and therefore are highly experienced and knowledgeable, but as Joe's already said, they then get written off as, oh, that old fogey, what would they know? They're not any longer doing active research. In some cases, it's not, that's true. It's not true in Professor Singer's case. But the reality is retired scientists have seen a lot of science. And if they give you an opinion, it tends to be a wiser opinion. Secondly, NIPCC activities are funded by untied family foundation donations through the Heartland Institute. There is no financial conflict of interest whatsoever. There is no oil industry or any other industry money gone into the production of NIPCC. No conflict of interest. Secondly, NIPCC summarises peer-reviewed scientific literature about climate change in the round. The IPCC is directed by its charter to investigate climate change caused by human carbon dioxide emissions. Not even all carbon dioxide, just human carbon dioxide emissions. And it shows in everything they write. They do not look at climate change in the round. In the contrary, we do. No a priori assumptions are made about the importance of particular causatory agents. Lastly, we act as a red team that undertakes due diligence on the conclusions and recommendations of the IPCC green team. Some of you will know this concept from industry, that if you have to develop a new car model or you've got a particularly difficult manufacturing problem, you take your conventional group and you give it to them and you give them some money and say, now go to it. But if it's important, you take an equivalent amount of money, that's the green team, and you give it to a red team expressly charged with lateral, original thinking to try and think of an innovative way to do the same job better and to act as an audit or due diligence group on the green team. It's a very well tried and tested technique in industry and the defence forces. It's now true in climate change. There's two kids on the block now, not just the IPCC, but the IPCC green conventional advice about carbon dioxide and the red team. And jump this, go to the last slide. Here we go. So 6 important NIPCC conclusions. The assumption that prior to the Industrial Revolution the Earth had a more stable climate is simply wrong. Climate's always changed, it always will. There's nothing unusual about the modern magnitudes or rates of change of temperature, ice volume, sea level, or extreme weather events. That is a flagrant, direct contradiction of everything the IPCC tells you. Yet it's arrived at by a group of scientists that have looked at the same basic corpus of literature and come to an opposite conclusion. The most likely medium-term threat, believe it or not, is of cooling. And that's because of solar activity, or rather lack of it. Can't go into it today, but that's the reality. For the next 20 or 30 years, we are more likely to cool than we are to warm. Atmospheric CO2 is neither a pollutant nor is it the primary forcing agent for temperature change. Rather, carbon dioxide is an overall benefit for humankind, and you will understand why I have to wash my mouth out, having said that. Attempting to stop climate change is an expensive act of utter futility. You might as well stand under the shower, tear up billion-dollar notes and throw them down the drain hole. The only sensible thing to do about climate change is to adapt to it, both benign warmings and the more dangerous coolings. Have you ever heard a politician say, I'm going to stop that volcanic eruption, or let's stop that earthquake over there? And you laugh them out of court, don't you? Yet you haven't been laughing them out of court when they've said to you, we're going to stop climate change. Every bit as stupid. Climate change, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes are all natural phenomena that we do not completely understand, we certainly can't predict, and we certainly can't stop when they start. The only sensible public policy, it's a total no-brainer, it is going to happen in due course, irrespective of what happens to the IPCC, is that you have to adapt to climate events and change as they happen. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Dr. Carter. Dr. Singer.
Okay.
Tough act to follow.
Well, Bob has given a very masterful exposition, which combines science, policy. There's very little I can add, except to mention that he is, I'm pleased to have him as co-author. And there's a third co-author, Craig Idso, in Arizona. The three of us are the lead authors of the CCR2 report, and we're very fortunate that the Heartland Institute has published these reports. Very difficult to get good publishers, and we didn't have any clear idea when things started 10 years ago how we're going to present this material. Joe Bast has given a lot of his personal attention to this and really shaped our reporting and our presentation, and that's very important. So now we are on a book tour to show off our more recent report, which responds directly to the IPCC that was released just last week. So we've been in England, Bob and I have been in Germany, we've been in Holland, now we're in California, I think. I'm not quite sure where we are, and I'm losing my voice. Anyway, I want to add just two small points. One is really amusing. The IPCC is a funny organization. There hasn't been any warming, any significant observed warming in the last 17 years. 17 years. The climate has been reasonably steady. And carbon dioxide has been rising ever more rapidly, thanks to the Chinese and India and people in India who are using a lot of coal. And by the way, who are benefiting global agriculture by raising the CO2 level in the atmosphere. We thank them for that. They thought that was wonderful. Anyway, the IPCC, let me start with their third report in 2001. In their summary, they said they were 66% sure that the observed warming, was due to human activities, specifically carbon dioxide released by humans. In the fourth report, in 2007, they were 90% sure. In their current report, released 2 weeks ago, they are now more than 95% sure. They're becoming ever more sure. You can see that they're racking up the certainty, or at least they're telling people that they're more certain, and the climate isn't even warming. So what's going on? What are they sure about? That the climate isn't warming? I won't say any more about this because our report deals with the temperature very well, I think, and our summary, which you've seen, which is on your seat, addresses these issues. I want to talk a little bit about sea level rise. That's sort of an esoteric subject. It's of tremendous importance, not in California perhaps, but on the East Coast, where I live, in Virginia. It's important all along the East Coast, from Florida all the way up into New England. People are concerned about sea level rise. Of course, that's also where hurricanes strike. So and the higher the sea level, the more damaging a hurricane is likely to be. So what do we know about sea level rise? We have good, again, geological information. We have to go back to geology to get perspective on these topics. During the last ice age, which is only 18,000 years ago, sea level was about 400 feet lower than it is today. So it has risen 400 feet in the last 18,000 years. We're fairly sure about that. And no one really disputes this. At one time, you could walk from England to France. There was no North Sea. Sea level then started to rise as continental ice sheets melted, and has been rising over the last many centuries now, at about 7 inches a century, not this much. And the IPCC, in their reports, has been reducing their estimates for sea level rise, quite properly, I think, until the last report, the current one. Now, the fourth report in 2007 was considered to be too conservative and was criticized by alarmists. So now the current report has tripled, just about tripled, their estimates of sea level rise for the year 2100. I'll show you a slide that comes from that report. I'm one of the many reviewers of the IPCC, and I've chosen the chapter on sea level rise for review. And here it is. I need some help. Oh, here it is. I can find it now. It's this one here. Do I do? Yeah, here it is. You probably can't read the years. Sorry about that. But it starts at 1700 and ends at 2100. As you can see, it's taken directly from the IPCC report of the advanced draft. There's a sudden increase in sea level. Let me use this. Thank you. Sudden increase here. In 1880, what happened in 1880 to cause sea level to rise suddenly? Anyone here remember? You're not old enough. I don't remember. I wasn't around in 1880, in spite of what some of you may think. Anyway, then in 1993, there's another sudden rate of sudden acceleration here. 1993. What happened in 1993? Does anyone know?
Volcano in the Philippines? I can't remember.
They introduced a new measuring system, and which gave about double the rate of rise, and has not been calibrated properly. Not many people believe it, except the people who are propagating it, and the IPCC apparently believes it because they're using it. So that's a fake. Then they say, during the 20th century, sea level rise accelerated from here to here. Well, did it accelerate? Did it go? Not according to the best data we have, which I will show you. Oops. Yeah. Okay, this is the best data we have from tidal gauges, published in a very respectable peer-reviewed journal. And look, sea level rise continues to about 1960, and then it decelerates. Okay, my trick question, what happened in 1960? I'll give you a hint. Who was it that said in 2008 that if he's elected President of the United States, the Earth will heal and sea level and ocean rise will slow? Who said that? Obama. And when was he born? In 1961. When was he conceived? In 1960. And I can imagine the angel coming to his mother and saying, you shall have a son, and his name will be Barack Hussein, and he will heal the earth and slow the rise of the ocean. And there you have it. What can I say? So you see, most of the people working in this field actually believe that sea level rise is fluctuating, but it is not accelerating. And that by the year 2100, we will have another 5 inches for what it is now. Nothing much to worry about. it'll continue to rise as ice in the Antarctic slowly melts until the next ice age, which may come
Anytime
turn to
now.
evolve
Anytime now.
anytime now, and then sea level will drop.
Which for a
because
geologist
ocean water will evaporate
1,000 years.
and form ice on the Antarctic and on the continents, and you will have ice covering the northern Europe and North America, and sea level will again drop as it has before. So that's the essential story on sea level rise, and I'm very happy to be able to tell you about it because it's one of the main concerns that people have these days. No one really worries about temperature very much, particularly if you live in the Midwest. After all, in Minnesota or Wisconsin, temperatures from the summer to winter vary by, 60, 80 degrees or more? Much more, even from day to night. But sea level rise is a serious business in Virginia, where I live, and along the East Coast. So that is the story. Sea level rise is not accelerating in spite of the increase in carbon dioxide, and will not accelerate, and there's nothing we can do about it. It's like the tides. We adjust to it. And that's what I told the Dutch in The Hague, and they were quite happy about it because they've been adjusting to sea level rise now for hundreds of years, and they know how to deal with it. Thank you very much.
So we have some time for questions if people have them. I'll use my moderator's privilege and lead off. Could you comment a little bit on, with the IPCC's claim of a causal connection between human industrial activity and climate, could you comment on what the main source of evidence or argument is that they give for that, and how you would respond to it? Is it primarily the climate models?
Oh dear.
Well, rephrase the question.
Oh, sorry. What is the evidence that the IPCC uses to adduce their idea that warming is caused by human carbon dioxide emissions? What is the evidence for that?
Yeah. There's chapter 10 in the report. It's called Attribution. There's a whole chapter devoted to trying to figure out what it is that's causing climate change. That's the technical meaning of the word attribution. What they do is they compare models and observations. Even if they were to agree, it wouldn't prove anything. It could be a coincidence. But the models they use do not include the most important forcings. They're incomplete. They do not include solar activity changes. They do not include changes in the solar magnetic field. They do not include the effects of cosmic rays. The observations they use are similarly flawed. They use only surface data from weather stations. But they disagree with every other data set. The satellites that measure temperatures of the atmosphere don't show any warming during the same period, while the thermometers on the surface do show warming. We think that's probably a distortion due to what's called the urban heat island effect. You know, most weather stations are located in urban areas or in airports. Even there are very few truly rural stations that are unaffected by human activities. And they don't know how to subtract the urban effects. We've made a small study to show that airports are the ones that show a continuous warming. Okay, I will accept the fact that airports are warming. That's not global warming. Airports are warming because of increased traffic, increased runways, more cities are being built around airports. My airport, the Dulles, used to be way, way out in the countryside in Virginia. Now it's become a satellite city to Washington, D.C. There you have it.
I'll just show a slide that relates to that same question. So this is the IPCC models, 72 of them in the fine lines, projecting temperature from 1975 through to 2020. And here plotted are the results of actual measurements from satellite data sets and from weather balloon data sets. And you see that the two independent sets of observations are very close to each other, and that the warming trend here is extremely low, if any, whereas the warming trend here is pervasive because, of course, it's programmed into the models. Now, two things. They like to talk about, the IPCC likes to talk about the ensemble average. The ensemble is all these 72 different models. The average is the average of all those 72 models. Now, think about that. At the very best, one of those models might be right, or might not. But 71 are certainly wrong. So what they're saying is, if we take the average of all the wrong numbers, we will actually get the right number. This isn't the sort of science I was trained to do at university. Furthermore, you look inside any of the IPCC report, any of the consultancy reports that come out. Well, how am I going to get to the next slide? Here we go. This happens to be from the Australian scientific agency CSIRO, which runs one of the models for the IPCC. Inside the cover of every single CSIRO modelling report is the following statement. This report relates to climate change scenarios based on computer modelling. Models involve simplifications of the real process. When did you last read that in USA?
That's an honest statement.
Of course, accordingly, no responsibility will be accepted by CSIRO or the Queensland Government that commissioned this report for the accuracy of forecasts or predictions inferred from this report, or for any person's interpretations, deductions, conclusions, or actions in reliance on this report. Would you buy a used car from the internet? But governments all around the world are treating these models as if they were accurate predictions.
Good for Queensland. Let me add one small point. 72 models. Why 72? Why not just one that works, that is validated by observations? The answer is that IPCC is a political organization. Every country now, worth its salt, has to have at least one climate model. The United States has 5. Why do we need 5? Well, because we have ambitious groups around the country, and everybody has to have a model. Colorado has one, New Jersey has one, what else?
NASA.
NASA has one in New York, right? And there are others. You know, it's a matter of pride. And obviously, IPCC takes models if they come from Albania or Zimbabwe. It doesn't make any difference. A to Z. They all have to be considered equivalent. This is why taking an average of these models makes absolutely no sense. They have different quality, they have different parameters, they have different forcings.
I'd like to add one comment to your express question, which was what is the evidence for? And the answer is there is no evidence. None.
So the claim of a causal connection is based entirely on the computer simulations. Yeah.
Yeah, the lies being perpetrated on climatology and geology are criminal, but even more confounding is the fact that I think Mr. Bass referred to it, is that warming times have been a boon to mankind throughout his evolution.
Yeah, and if environmentalists cared about human well-being, that would occur to them, and they would realize what a threat that is to their whole scare campaign. But of course they don't, and so they completely overlook, how well we did in the medieval warm period. We were building cathedrals. I mean, imagine that. And correct me if I'm wrong, a cathedral in Greenland. Greenland had, I know, churches, and they have the ruins of these things, but I'm pretty sure they even had a cathedral in Greenland. So how wealthy does a society have to be in the medieval times with very rudimentary technology to be able to build masterful architecture, buildings that are still up today? I mean, the weather was very conducive to human success and progress and innovation. And to be able to imagine getting back to that should be inspiring to all of us. But of course, that's exactly the opposite of what they want.
Before the use of fossil fuels, most economies were really built on agriculture. Agriculture obviously benefits from warmer weather, longer growing season, fewer frosts, better harvests, and you can see the results.
Man.
So we had a question at the back.
And their information seems to be based on the computer, what the computer is kicking out. In the old days, we used to call it garbage in, garbage out.
That's exactly right. Well, in the summary for policymakers, you're going to see a slightly different argument that might be worth kind of summarizing real quickly right now, that the IPCC relies on 3 lines of argumentation. One is the computer models, which are unreliable. Garbage in, garbage out is exactly why these things are unreliable. The second is circumstantial evidence. So they'll point to changes in the migration of butterflies, or crop production, or melting ice on mountaintops. And they'll say, well, this kind of suggests that a warming trend is taking place, and this kind of supports our theory, but it's all circumstantial evidence. And those of you who remember the scientific method, you can always find circumstantial evidence to support any theory, especially when you have big databases and you just dredge the data, and you will get evidence in support of a theory. What you're really looking for in science is to disprove a theory or a hypothesis, not find evidence that might support it. So all this circumstantial evidence, which fills these big, thick volumes, doesn't support the hypothesis at all. It's just circumstantial evidence. And the final thing is what we called, or I think Dr. Carter suggested calling postulates, which are essentially assertions about the relationship between two things. So they postulate that climate warming, atmospheric warming, will cause thermal expansion, melting, and sea level rise. And they kind of assert that and imagine that that's some sort of a scientific claim or prediction. But in fact, it's a theory just like any other theory, subject to being tested and disproven. And you look through their reports and there's postulate after postulate pretending to be a scientific statement or a fact that in fact is just yet another theory that's thrown out there to make their hypothesis look credible. Is that an accurate way of describing it? Okay.
So when you put out these comprehensive criticisms, does the IPCC engage with you, or do they ignore it, or do they have something to say? And has it improved over time?
It's a very interesting phenomenon that, starting with their third assessment report in 2001, since then there has been worldwide collusion, for want of a better word, amongst IPCC scientists that they will not appear on a public stage to debate any of the science with independent scientists of equivalent scientific stature. Now, you may say, well, that's ridiculous. Who pays their wages? The public. Why won't they front up? Well, the answer is they're politically very smart. And they do that quite deliberately and knowingly in order to starve the other side of the oxygen of publicity. And their line, their pitch is, there is a consensus. The science is settled. There's nothing to debate. By definition, if Professor Singer wants to argue the other side, he's a crank, and we are not getting up on stage with a crank. Now, it's amazing, even as I tell that they've managed to hold that line with very few exceptions, I only know of 3, for more than 10 years. And I am repeatedly invited to participate in public debate by independent people like you who say, well, look, the obvious thing to do is just get these 2 guys together and let's listen to both of them. And never have the people that have invited me been able to get an IPCC person to appear in public on the same stage. That is what is unique about the meeting that Fred and I have just been to in The Hague. That is the first time that we know of anywhere in Europe that there has been a meeting at which we gave 2 presentations, and of the other 2 people, one of them is a senior advisor to the IPCC. And just by being on the same stage as us, you can see straight away that concedes some credibility to us, and you can see why they are so determined they won't normally do that.
Yeah, let me add one thing to this. Our original impetus for what became NIPCC was frustration with IPCC's ignoring published work that we thought was relevant. They just ignored. At that time, a number of us came from a different discipline, astrophysics, where we looked particularly at what are called solar terrestrial relationships. We know that the sun can affect many things on the Earth. There's aurora borealis, there's magnetic storms, all kinds of things that have nothing to do with the total energy output of the sun, but refer to magnetic activity on the sun. Sunspots, for example, which are an indicator of this. So that's what the impetus, and the IPCC still does not acknowledge the existence of these reports in the literature, published work by credible scientists. They're not meteorologists, they're astrophysicists or physicists. They really work in a slightly different discipline, and they're not acknowledged. I'd like to show just one slide, if I may. Ask Amanda to help me. This is the key slide that I'd like to show, which I'll explain. It comes from a paper in Nature, which is a well-respected journal, or used to be a well-respected journal. Go towards the end. It'll show up.
It's the top one there, Amanda.
This one?
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. This comes from a paper in Nature 2001. I'll take your slide again. Thank you. Published by Neff and colleagues in Heidelberg, Germany. You know what a stalagmite is, of course. It's a thing that grows up from the bottom of a cave, and every year it adds another layer, and you can date things accurately, like you do deep sea cores or ice cores. Very nice. And this comes from Oman, which is on the Arabian Peninsula somewhere, I think on the corner of the peninsula. Anyway, you see here carbon-14 measured and oxygen-18 measured. Well, Bob has already discussed oxygen-18, or at least he's used it. Oxygen-18 is a proxy for temperature. Carbon-14 is produced by cosmic rays in the Earth's upper atmosphere. That's the only source, until we had bomb explosions, for carbon-14. The only source. So it's produced by cosmic rays, and cosmic rays are modulated by solar activity. Solar magnetic fields projected into interplanetary space affect the intensity of cosmic rays hitting the Earth's atmosphere, and therefore affect the concentration of carbon-14. Now you see, this is a period of 3,000 years. The central part is blown up here. This is 400 years. Same data, just blown up. Look at the correlation between carbon-14 and oxygen-18. Normally, I don't pay much attention to correlations because they don't tell you much about causation. But in this case, we know that the Earth's climate cannot affect the sun. It has to be the sun affecting the Earth's climate. We know the direction. It's obvious. So here we are. Steinway shows a remarkable close correlation, carbon-14 and over a period of more than 3,000 years. So a strong association between solar activity and temperature. You know, this is kind of a convincing demonstration of data, which I think any of us would accept. And we couldn't figure out why does the IPCC not quote this work or use it. Well, there are two answers. One, they don't know how to incorporate it into models. And two, it would destroy their pretty picture of human-caused CO2 causing climate change. Well, so they just ignore it. What do they say? They say it's controversial. You know, that's a nice excuse.
Indeed. Let me quickly add, Craig Idso, who is the third co-author of the report, has been posting reviews of all the scientific literature on climate change on his website. Actually, NIPCC.org.
Yeah.
And thousands of summaries of climate research appear on that site. And the purpose for doing that was so that the IPCC couldn't say, oh, we didn't see that study, or we didn't know what the implications of it were. Every day, over and over again, he's posting this research. Our books essentially compile all those summaries of academic research. So part of the purpose was to make sure the IPCC was influenced by the research and the writing that we were doing every step of the way. It was kind of our effort at transparency and shaming the IPCC into covering the research that was actually out there and not just pretending that it doesn't exist. I think in the final review of the most recent IPCC report, our impact may have been to get them to try to cover up admissions of and backtracking from some of their past claims. So unfortunately, you know, I think they had a choice. They could have said, well, we've looked at the NIPCC stuff, we look at all these reviews, we have to admit there's a debate taking place, we have to admit that we're not as confident as we used to be. I think they could have said that. And instead they said, oh shit, somebody is exposing us and we gotta hide and deflect and obfuscate the truth. And I think that's what you see in this last report. More lying and more deception than we saw in the fourth report.
I think I agree. Bob made the point earlier that both IPCC and NIPCC use the same corpus, the same idea of peer-reviewed papers in respected journals, except that the IPCC ignores those that disagree with their conclusion. That's perhaps a quick way of putting it.
Are you basically, is the contention that that CO2 is a greenhouse gas that somehow retains heat is mitigated by a whole host of so many other factors that it's almost rendered meaningless over time? Or is it because as a non-scientist, even trying to understand how weather or climate works, even how you would construct, try to separate out all the controls, I'm not even quite sure, it'd be fascinating to when studying weather, how does one try to figure out what is causing what? And is it that CO2 is not a greenhouse gas at all, or the whole premise of greenhouse gases is ludicrous, or it's mitigated by too many other factors to be rendered meaningless, I guess is my question.
Thank you.
I assume one of the scientists can answer that. Fred, you probably didn't hear the question?
That's okay.
No, I was paying attention. What was the question?
The answer is that the feedbacks are many and varied. And the IPCC and the NIPCC scientists together agree that from first principles, the amount of warming you will get from a doubling of carbon dioxide is about 1.1 degrees. That's not a disputed statement. However, that's not enough to produce dangerous warming. So if you're the IPCC now, you're looking for something that can multiply that factor. And the logic goes like this. If it gets a bit warmer, and we have a bit more carbon, if we emit some extra carbon dioxide, get a little bit warmer. If it gets a little bit warmer, there will be more evaporation of water from the oceans. True. If there's more evaporation of the waters from the ocean, we've now got more water vapour, which is a powerful greenhouse gas in itself. True. Therefore, we have a positive feedback loop based on that. That's fine as far as it goes. The question is, though, why does the IPCC then ignore lots of other feedback loops, including a critical one that relates also to the water cycle, which is you evaporate a little bit more water from the ocean because it's a little bit warmer because of carbon dioxide. Not only does it give you extra water vapour in the atmosphere, but of course that water vapour in part gives you more low clouds. Low clouds are Earth's cooling thermostat because they reflect back into space the solar radiation. They cause cooling. So more low clouds, cooling. And nobody actually knows the exact balance, which was part of your question. That's unknown. But there are both positive feedback loops and negative feedback loops. And the IPCC overwhelmingly concentrates on the positive. One other thing relevant to this same question is most people think carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. Yes, it is. Nobody doubts that. Well, what that means is, here's my graph. If carbon dioxide increases along here, then of course temperature is going to increase up there, and we think of this relationship. We think of a straight line relationship. It is remarkable that never have I seen it pointed out in any public discussion that that is not the case. This is the case. If you start, this is increments of carbon dioxide, 20 parts, 40 parts, 60 parts per million along here. If you start in a planetary atmosphere to accumulate carbon dioxide, the first 20 parts per million is a really powerful greenhouse gas. It gives you about 1.5 degrees of warming. This is not plotted in degrees, but that's about 1.5 degrees of warming. The next 20 parts per million, for a total of 40, gives you about another 1/4 degree of warming, and so on. So that if you add up these 3 bars here, that equals about 2 degrees warming. That's a lot of warming for just 60 parts per million of greenhouse gas. But what you now see is that the nature of the relationship, as we incrementally add more 20 parts per million, it's a logarithmic curve which trails off parallel to the axis at infinity. So how powerful a greenhouse gas is, or carbon dioxide is, and whether you should worry about it, depends profoundly on where you are on this logarithmic curve. And the reality is, you've already heard me give the figures on a different slide, that during the interglacial, before the Industrial Revolution, we had 280 parts per million. We now have added to the atmosphere such that we now have 390 parts per million. Greenpeace tells us we can't double. That means we can't go to 560 parts per million. Supposing we did, 560 is about here, and the incremental warming from today to there is just these little things added up here, constantly diminishing as this logarithmic curve gets closer and closer to the baseline. And when you add all these little bits up, you'll get about 1 degree, 1.1 degrees that I told you about before of warming. And if you then double it again, you'll get another 1.1 degrees of warming. It's a situation where for every extra greenhouse carbon dioxide buck, you get less and less temperature. No, what's the word?
Increment?
Diminishing returns.
Yeah.
I've lost the what's the phrase?
Bang.
Bang. For every extra carbon dioxide bang, you get less and less temperature bucks. Now that is a profoundly important thing to understand. It means that the more China puts out, the less the effect. You never ever hear that discussed. So the answer to your question is twofold. The first is there's lots of feedbacks, we don't know them all, but the IPCC concentrates, because it suits them to, only on the positive feedbacks, especially water vapour. The second one is whether carbon dioxide is a threat or not depends very much on where you are on this logarithmic curve, and we're already well past the shoulder. One last comment. During the last glaciation and previous glaciations, carbon dioxide went down to 180 parts per million. If it had gone down just 30 more to 150 parts per million, we would have had a real biodiversity crisis, because photosynthesis stops working basically at levels below 150 parts per million, and the entire plant kingdom would keel over. So it's not global warming that's the biodiversity threat, it's global cooling. Last comment. where is this carbon dioxide going between glaciers and glaciers? About 100 difference. And the answer is it goes into the oceans. During glaciation, the cold water absorbs less of the carbon dioxide and it outgasses when you warm up. So that's...
You can see that this business involves many different disciplines. I don't know if there are any physicists in this audience.
There's one here.
There's one. The logarithmic dependence is not a law of nature. It is an approximation to the absorption of spectral lines, which depends critically on the shape of wings. And there are many disputes on this. But the logarithmic approximation is good enough for many purposes. So we use it.
Since the IPCC is so difficult to engage, where are you getting a hearing and an audience for your reports and what you say?
From the Ayn Rand Center.
But we are an easy one. We are on your side, so where else?
We have printed and distributed 80,000 copies of this. We send it to all the professors of physical sciences at every university in the United States. We've distributed over 100,000 copies, I think, of Fred's original report in 1998, Nature, Not Man.
2008.
2008?
Yeah.
Yeah, controls the climate. What we're doing is going around the IPCC directly to the science community, around the mainstream media to opinion leaders and educators. So we'll send it to the science teachers of every private K-12 school in the United States. There's a huge number of teachers in public schools, so it's just too big a list for us to mail to. But we take a sample of that. I think it was 5,000 or 10,000 names out of that we mailed to as well. Civic and business leaders, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, all elected officials. So every national, state, and local elected official in the United States is on our mailing lists. One thing that we learned in marketing ideas is repetition is really key. Anybody who's into marketing, you know that you can't just send them a study once and then don't talk to them for 3 months. They forget who you are, they won't open it, they won't pay attention. But if you can get the repetition thing going so that an elected official is in effect trained to expect a publication from you every week or every month, then they'll start paying attention to it. So Heartland has, for the last 16 years, been sending a publication every week to every national and state elected official and about 8,000 local elected officials. Every 2 years we do a survey, random survey by an independent contractor to see if they're actually reading our stuff. And it's 80% of all state legislators report reading at least one of our publications, sometimes or always. So I think we got access to elected officials that way. So we flow this information into publications that they're already reading. We do mailings right to influential people. We work with allies. Heritage Foundation did a great event with us 2 weeks ago. And of course, we post all of this online. So climatechangereconsidered.org is the website. The whole report is on there. And video from all these conferences that we've held. We've held 8 international conferences on climate change. Over 4,000 people attended. And the video of all those presentations is online. And so we get hundreds of thousands of people looking at these videos, especially high school kids and college students. This is the way that they learn these days. It's just going to YouTube and finding videos of scientists talking about the issue. So we can reach huge audiences with this information.
We face a special problem in publication. Have you all heard about the ClimateGate emails? Yeah. The evidence is there. As soon as a paper from a skeptical group or a skeptic is published in a respected peer-reviewed journal, this does happen occasionally when we have an editor who is impartial and when he picks referees who are reasonably balanced. This peer review business depends very much on the editor. He can always pick reviewers who will say this paper is no good. Or he can pick reviewers who will say, go ahead and publish it. Okay, this happened to us. We published a paper in the International Journal of Climatology. As soon as it appeared, as soon as it was published on the web, it appeared on the internet, a task group was formed among the alarmists, and we see it in the emails that this paper has to be destroyed. This is a terrible event. So they produced a paper with 24 co-authors. 24. Can you imagine 24 co-authors? Well, it was written by one guy, and he got it published because the editor, Glenn McGregor, in Auckland, you know him, played along with it. They bullied him, and he published a paper. And now they say, well, the original paper by us is old science, or it's controversial. It's dead science.
Yeah, it's a wonderful. Control of language is brilliant from the other side, and you all know this because you've been talked into it yourself. You all talk about carbon, for example. Nothing to do with carbon. It's to do with carbon dioxide. And yet we have people up to the level of prime ministers and premiers getting up in public and talking about the carbon problem. Let's have a carbon tax. It's not a carbon tax. It's a carbon dioxide tax. You don't talk about Los Angeles water supply in terms of hydrogen. Well, Schwarzenegger might, but most of us don't. So control of language is brilliant, and this one that Fred's just given you is an example of that. That's really clever language. So they now talk about Fred's earlier paper as that's dead science. I mean, that's clever. And just consider the fact you're seeing here two random skeptical scientists. Yet the event that Fred's just told you about, I have had exactly the same experience of publishing a skeptical paper, getting it through in the mainstream literature, immediately, literally overnight, an international hit team is assembled to write the destruction of that paper and make sure it becomes, in their lingo, dead science. Then, when you are offered, as you must be by an international journal, the right of reply, you write a reply to the criticism showing it's without foundation, and they refuse to publish it. That's what happens.
So a question sort of follow up from others is they basically, the government and with the US government and international agencies, they basically control the funding. They largely control publications, and to a large extent they control the narrative. So my question is, and I applaud your efforts, but what are the signs you see that your efforts are having an effect? Are you winning?
This is, I think there's a couple of answers to this, but I'll start by saying on the science level, I think we're definitely winning. I don't have any doubt about that. I think the IPCC's report this time around is the laughingstock of the science community. They have backtracked so far on so many points. They've tried to fudge data. I mean, if you just compare the last draft of their summary for policymakers to the one that they actually approved and look at the changes, I mean, they're deliberately making editorial changes to hide admissions of how their models don't work and admissions of how the temperature hasn't raised. And I mean, all these admissions, and good scientists see that. They're not ignorant, they're not stupid. I think they realize that they've been played by the IPCC and they're finished with it. So I think we're at a real turning point in the debate. I think this book played a role, but it's partly just because you cannot corrupt science this way. People notice, and it eventually starts to affect my research. When you're making claims about how the world is getting warmer, and my own research says, well, it hasn't warmed here. You know, oh, well, they falsified the data in order to make it look like it's warming. And when you start to see that, it forces you to change. On the political level, I don't think there's a Republican in the House who will vote for carbon taxes or cap and trade. I think there's a lot of interest in defunding EPA. I think even in the Supreme Court, you know, they were supposed to, apparently they've decided now that they will. Yeah, I forwarded the email to you this morning. The Supreme Court will take a look at the challenges to the EPA's endangerment finding.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's good news.
That is good news. Now, will they?
We've applied for CERT. Our organization was one that applied for CERT along with others. and we weren't sure. We know that the Supreme Court would make a judgment in October. This is October. So they decided to hear our case.
I think they've decided to put it on the list.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that means.
I don't know. Well, the Court of Appeals turned us down, but there were two judges on the full court who made powerful arguments, and we used those in requesting the Supreme Court for a rehearing on this. And it would be wonderful news if indeed they do
Well,
this.
let's hope so. So I think politically, I think scientifically, public opinion is on our side. There's only about 32%, 36% of the public who thinks that global warming is both man-made and a problem. And I suspect that that overstates it by 5 or 10% just because you're polling people who aren't working and sitting at home watching soap operas when the phone call comes in. So I think we're just winning on a whole bunch of points. But you'll never see that in the mainstream media. So when you pick up the newspaper, you think we're losing. But I think really the truth is we're winning.
Picking up the political angle, some of you will know that Australia's government has recently changed, and the new right-wing government that has been elected was elected specifically on the pledge they will repeal the carbon dioxide tax. That is epoch-making, not just in Australia, but worldwide. And for example, the European Union was delighted that after Australia brought in its tax about 12 months ago, it then proceeded to link it to the level and the cost structure in Europe. That was the first sign Europe has had from anywhere in the world anybody else was prepared to basically do business on this. Now that is being destroyed. So what you have is the world's largest political lobby group, the European Union, are stuck like a shag on a rock. They have rocketing energy prices. They have major German manufacturers like Mercedes-Benz and BMW threatening to move, and not just threatening, they will move overseas unless something is done. And the signs out of Brussels are unmistakable that the EU is going to have to start backing down on this carbon trading stuff. So the politics is starting to run our way, but as Joe says, don't expect the New York Times to editorialize tomorrow that the IPCC got it wrong, because they won't.
Yeah,
But I'm sorry to say that here in California, you'll have an example of cap and trade, and you'll be able to see how it works, not works.
So what is a shag on a rock?
I'm sorry I have to tell you this.
I'm
but
sure it's the same bird in Australia and North America. Certainly it's the same bird in Europe, and a shag is a big black cormorant that catches fish.
Yeah.
And they sit on rocks on their own offshore. And that's what the EU looks like. There it is.
I'm
Shag
sure people call them shags in California. In Illinois, we call them camerons. More questions?
I think we have, unless you guys can stay a little longer, I think we're close to the wrap-up, so we have one more.
Mine was just a follow-up on, so if more and more scientists are seeing problems, are you seeing scientists move from one camp, towards your camp?
Many of them can't. The intimidation on mid-career and younger scientists is horrible. If you're in a faculty position as a young or middle-ranking researcher, you cannot speak out in public on this issue, or you will lose your research funding and your job.
And do you guys have any angle to tackle that, or is that just a fact of life?
We're hoping to get, if you can reduce federal government funding of climate research, if we can defund EPA and decentralize it. Pat Michaels, who you probably recognize at the Cato Institute, for many years he's been advocating that the states should institute their own global warming research efforts. And that way you would have 50 different competing entities. And he thought that maybe that would somehow depoliticize or at least create some room for some dissent. We had some really good state climatologists who got essentially run out of office.
George Taylor in
George
Oregon.
Taylor, things like that. So some decentralization is part of the solution.
Lee Gerhardt in Kansas.
Yeah, when you distribute the reports, do you hear from scientists who basically say, I support what you're doing, but I can't go public?
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Yeah. I had lunch about a month ago with a very prominent professor of geology at the University of Chicago. And he said, I've been a skeptic forever. I'm not going to say his name until we're finished here. You may know him from the ozone debate. And he said, I'm going to wait until I'm retired before I speak out on this.
Yeah.
And he's going to retire in 1 year. And he says, I want to write on this, I want to do this and that and the other thing. And I said, it would be really useful for us if you were to speak out now. Don't wait a year. Here he is, a distinguished guy at a major university, and he is afraid to speak out.
So imagine what a 35-year-old faculty member feels.
Yeah. Now, Judith Curry, some of you may have read Judith Curry, or just Google Judith Curry. She is a fairly prominent climate scientist who has moved into the skeptic side, and she's getting enormous amount of flack and pressure from the alarmists for having done that. And she's got a great blog where she writes about what's happening and how this is radicalizing her. And I'm pretty sure that there are hundreds of thousands of climate scientists and physical scientists around the world who are looking at that blog and reading about what's happening to her and saying, maybe it's time for me to speak out. And she's a role model for these folks. And so I think that's how it happens. It's going to be the Judith Currys, and then more, and then more, and then finally, you hit a tipping point, I suppose, and we get kind of a quick conversion of the whole movement, I hope. All right, well, thank you very much. This has been excellent.